And let me go ahead and pull up today's paper, which Sue suggested. And I actually spent more time um, reading materials and methods than I did the actual content, because the data collection and analysis of this is out of my comfort zone and something I would like to become more conversant with. And several people on this call are actually involved in looking at our Palm Copus data right now, and we're sort of wrestling with the same lack of experience among many of us in looking at human data and analyzing human results. But the point of this paper is to do a meta-analysis of what people have been looking at in terms of achievement gaps between STEM students in groups that are traditionally overrepresented in STEM disciplines and marginalized groups in STEM disciplines, or maybe just saying underrepresented groups. With the very simple but, well, seemingly simple premise, can active learning mitigate achievement gaps? And so the short answer that this paper provides is yes. The more complicated answer gets to what you're doing for active learning, and something that I found myself obsessing over when I was reading this paper was intensity of active learning. Because I actually became self-conscious. I found myself thinking about my classes and thinking about if my intensity was good enough. Like we've talked about this a lot in this particular group, that many of us, and I am no exception, will say, oh, well, of course I use active learning and I embrace active learning. And then when I actually think about it and analyze what I do, I'm like, oh crap, I actually don't do this nearly as much as I think I do. And so the focus on intensity in this paper actually made me think about that with my own classes quite a bit. But taken together, what this paper argues is the data of many individual students examined, both in terms of exam scores and in terms of percent of students passing coursework, would suggest that groups that are underrepresented in STEM do benefit from active learning instruction. So that's the hypothesis that is tested and supported by this data. So let me ask you guys, just sort of start your impressions of what is said in this paper and how the data was generated. And I think that'll take us nicely into a discussion about maybe what we're doing in our own classes for this sort of work. So thoughts on the paper in general from the group?
I guess one thought I had is that I have several colleagues who are really resistant to active learning, and I sent them this paper.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I just put it in a link. I said, this is really interesting. You should just take a look.
Any
And
feedback?
they know,
Yeah.
but they've said to me the buzzword of active learning or flipping the classroom in conversations. And so, it's nice to see this data presented. And it just gives...
I've had a colleague that says so-called active learning, and I'm like, oh, that's a good headline.
And it's a lot of data, and it's really interesting. And so I'm hoping to sort of persuade them to try some active learning in the classroom. So that was my first impression of this paper.
Well, one of the things we're trying to do with this group is to make you all, what do you call it, disciples to spreading the good news to the ends of the earth about the gospel of active learning. So we appreciate that.
I also want to sort of reiterate what you said. Looking at the figures, it was hard. It was really hard to interpret figures, because I read the paper and then I just specifically honed in on the figures. Yeah. And I tried to sort of figure out what they were saying, and it's challenging for sure.
Yeah. I mean, it requires, when you have data like this, and I think most of us are trained traditionally as bench scientists first, and if we have this experience, it's something we've acquired later. I find it's more of the the younger generation that actually has straight up training in this kind of work. I think I've commented to Sue before on multiple occasions, like you now have this ability to get a degree in science education, which 20 years ago when I was being trained myself wasn't, if not an option, but very limited as an option. So for us, this is a harder push. I would ask if anyone in this group actually been involved in doing a meta-analysis, of actually going in and doing this kind of work. Yeah, me neither. And so I was struck. Let me just go ahead down to the materials and methods. Going through, looking at there we go. The criteria they used, especially here when they get to the coding section and they start to talk about all the ways they look at the criteria and try to avoid biases, throw out particular things that don't maybe fit a traditional, or not traditional, but don't fit a model they can analyze with any kind of efficacy, student equivalents, things like that. This is all mind-blowing to me. I mean, just the ability to go and take all this and sort of get trends that you can go ahead and isolate and analyze. With respect to the figures, let me ask how people felt about the data in this paper, and if they found what was said compelling with respect to the relationships with marginalized groups and their achievement in classes.
I'm not I know it's necessary, but I'm not a huge fan of lumping all underrepresented groups together, because I think that that's making assumptions about their experience that we shouldn't.
That's a fair point, yeah.
And I think about it a lot because our biggest underrepresented group in Montana are Native American students.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of their training, at least the tribes that are in our area, you don't make eye contact with your superiors and you don't question them and you don't speak up in class because that's disrespectful. So I think a lot about how an active learning classroom without any, I don't know, easing into it, because a lot of them come from the reservations and then they're coming into college as their first time off of the reservations. So how their system growing up might make it harder for them to feel accepted and perform well in a class that's run with a high level of active learning. So it may be really great for a lot of underrepresented minorities, but when you put them all together in one bunch, you're not hearing the whole story. And I'm sure they had to do that because all the studies their meta-analysis dealt with did that. But I'd like to see some studies that move beyond that.
That's a really interesting example, because a lot of times we talk about cultural competencies, and I'm not alone in this. Sometimes it's hard to understand when people say standardized tests can be biased, or certain examples used in class can be biased, and coming up with concrete examples can sometimes be difficult. That's a really interesting concrete example of a cultural norm that directly works against something you're trying to do, and therefore what workaround would you need to maybe adapt your population to be more comfortable with that. I want to use that example. I really like that. Thank you.
Well, I know this because somebody from one of the tribal colleges pulled me aside and was like, you keep asking my students if they have any questions, and they are not going to have any questions. You can stop asking them that.
Yeah, there's certainly other types of active learning techniques you can use that don't require students to talk directly to you or ask you questions. But yeah, you would really need to think through what to do to accommodate your very specific audience.
Well, just how Native American student in the classroom that everybody's talking to everybody and everybody's pulling the professor over like they're just a member of the class. It could be really overwhelming.
Huh.
I have found that at the institution that I did my Palm work at, which I've now changed jobs, so I'm not there anymore, but that had a very interesting, because you were talking about clumping, in that our Black population would be a mixture of people born in the United States that have come to this institution, but then it's a Catholic university and it has a very strong connection to the Bahamas. And so a very large proportion of our Black population, which we don't have a large Black population, but of that Black population were Bahamians. And so these are two very different groups, right? With two very different experiences before coming to college and what they brought with them culturally, right? And so we weren't, again, we have small numbers. So breaking out into smaller numbers legally wouldn't have been allowed, because then you would have been able to identify individuals. But it was a function in our data analysis, is, just we're treating this group as one group, but really they're probably not, in terms of, because the research was on sort of sense of belonging and attitudes and perceptions about a course. And, they're really probably not the same, but with small numbers, what are you going to do?
Yeah. So. And this is not an educational example, but a political example. A lot of articles have been written about the poll that was taken in Florida last week of the presidential election being tied, and it was talking about Latino support for different candidates. And many people have been quick to point out that the word Latino is an all-encompassing group, and that if you're Cuban or you're Mexican or you're from one of the Central American countries, they're different groups with different potential cultural, they're not a monolith, right? And again, not an educational example, but sort of the same point you guys are trying to make, that it would be interesting to do meta-analyses with these particular groups, but we probably have to deliberately from the ground up be doing that kind of work. And I guess that hasn't been done yet, or not done to a critical level yet.
Well, that would be the only way to get, unfortunately, right, because we have such a representation issue, it'd be the only way to get a large enough body. Like, I would never be allowed to report out anything and other than URM, right? Because the number would just be too small. And so legally that would never be allowed. So anything I publish will always have them clumped together.
So it becomes a chicken and egg issue, because you can't solve things until you figure out how, but you can't figure out how to have the people.
Right. So you would have to purposely want to reach out to many, to maybe similar institutions with similar makeups, but so that you could get a critical mass of Native American or, Bahamian groups.
Every time you say that, I think you're saying Bohemian, and I was like, oh, but
no.
that's a very different thing.
Very different. But that's why I think, and we were talking about this during that Copus meeting we had last week, why sometimes getting those papers that really in-depth hear from individuals really allows us to get that better context. That the meta-analysis reveals these data, but it doesn't give us the context and the meaning behind it. So you really do need all those types of studies. So.
I would like to talk about figure 4. Because this is, again, for me, this is what I was drawn to. I don't know why, but I went down this rabbit hole of the intensity of the intervention. I just got very interested in this. So first of all, if we look at this figure, there's actually a very interesting, and I wonder, probably not significant now that I'm looking at the error bars, but looking at passive versus low versus high intensity of active learning. And in a second, I'll get to what they mean by that, because I actually dug through the supplemental data to see what they were saying. They look at the exam score gap, and they look at the percent passing gap. And so the low intensity is what's interesting, that you see sort of a gradual improvement in exam score gap as you increase the amount of active learning that you do. But then when you actually look at the passing grade chart, you don't see a statistical difference with the low intensity. In fact, it drops a bit inexplicably. But then you have that big jump up to high intensity. And so as I'm looking at this, I really wanted to think about what this meant with respect to intensity. And so let me exchange my screen share here for a second. And pull.
Also, I guess what's kind of interesting about that figure is the exams sort of, it looks like the exams are getting better with the traditional and then low and then high intensity.
Yeah.
The scores are getting better, but then how is the
What's with the
final grade getting worse in that low category?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Percent grade passing. It's strange.
And
I was also wondering,
go for it.
I don't know if there's more assignments in the active learning classes, the high intensity active learning classes, besides exams, that are sort of buffering the exam grade.
Yeah, and so there's sort of a larger question to be asked there, sort of the notion of exam grade. And as you say, like, what else is there that's helping with formative assessment along the way, things like that. What level, I admit I'm not up to speed on what level classes we're looking at in this analysis, or if that was, I believe they actually try to normalize that, but I'm not, we have to go back and look at the materials and methods for that. Let me show you what they came up with respect to learning intensity. And so they binned this, as they say, low, medium, or high. And the way they did this was, did you spend, basically in thirds, was 0 to 33% of your class active learning based techniques, 34 to 66%, or 67 to 100%. And so this is a very detailed description. So here are a couple examples of descriptions they found in their particular studies of what they would call low intensity active learning. So typical lecture-based content and format. Up here, it's pretty clear about what they're doing. In number 2, it's less evidence, but what over here on the right, the explanation, what they're saying is they can infer from what's written here that it's pretty much. Hi, everybody. Are we all here? I think we all just got blown off Zoom there for a second. Let me. Oh, we're still recording and everything. That was weird. All right, let's go back to where we left off. Okay. The explanation here would say that we can infer a low level of active learning techniques. And further down, this is where it gets real interesting, the medium intensity, sort of what is the threshold? And this is where I started thinking about my own class, because I like to think I'm always using active learning, right? Do I reach the threshold of medium intensity active learning in my class? I don't have any flipped classes personally. I have an intro class I'm running right now that meets 3 days a week, and I dedicate 1 day a week completely to active learning techniques, which would put me square on the low threshold here for medium intensity. And so then I started thinking about my other 2 sessions. I'm like, do I do just a little more in there to put me over the top? I'm not sure. But in these cases, you have sort of a classic presentation here where you present material for a period of the class, you do an activity in the middle, and then you sort of have, what do you call it, report outs here in the end. So in the middle, you sort of have this section where you do active learning each time. And then down here, very specific, about 40% of class time, structured self-selected teams, with guided inquiry exercises. So the dedication here would be about 1/3 to 2/3 of your time is spent doing active learning techniques. I should have mentioned at the beginning, the paper is explicit on defining active learning as something departing from traditional lecture with an emphasis on group style activity and doing in-class activity. So that is this group's working definition. And then down here, the idea of high intensity, at least 2/3 of your class is dedicated to some form of active learning technique. And so you see here an example of what they're doing in class that would get you to that point where you have a much more intense environment related to active learning exercises. And if you look in the paper, the main body of the paper, not this supplemental part, basically, so long as about 1/3 of your class or more doing active learning, or you spend less than 2/3 of your time lecturing, you're considered to be in some phase of an active learning class. The question is then your degree of intensity. So if I go back, that brings us back to our figure here of the consideration of the amount of active learning you're doing in a class, and the notion that if you're doing a really dedicated experience, that there is evidence of more success in terms of minimizing differences. So I suppose what I would ask here is, why do you suppose that is? And how do you feel about, reflecting on your own classes and the data you're seeing here, this notion of intensity of active learning and the balance that you need to strike between presenting some content and actually getting active learning in your class, sort of spinning all those plates and getting everything done that you need to get done.
I wonder if using low intensity active learning just annoys students because it's an interruption. It's a minority of what's going on in the classroom that it's seen as a pain in the neck.
That's an interesting idea, that like you have it present in just a low, like below a threshold quantity, that it's not accepted as like operating practice, like more as a diversion.
Yeah.
Right, because like active learning is sort of, I mean, it's a culture, right?
Yeah,
There's a way that a classroom runs and an attitude that the instructor and the students have to have in order to have it truly be, a functioning active learning classroom. And I mean, I've always gotten students complaining that they want more lecture, right? But I feel like once I became more experienced at it, and was doing it more in the classroom, that those complaints lessened. I think it became more of this is just the experience, and then maybe it became more enjoyable as it became more of a function. So I'm wondering, I guess, sorry, rambling thoughts. I'm wondering, one, if it's the student attitude, if this is just an inconvenience or an interruption in what's supposed to happen. But also if people that are less experienced and therefore possibly less good at it are doing the low intensity, as they're getting their feet wet and they're starting into it, and maybe it just isn't as effective because of that.
Maybe it's more the sense of belonging if they're talking a lot about group work here. So if you're working with a group every single day for the majority of the class, maybe you're more invested to not fail the class. So
I can think of,
you're needed in that group, so you show up more often.
and I'm thinking there about if you have colleagues who teach organic chemistry, where POGIL is part of the culture, where they get the problems and like everything is done in group work, and the work of you and your comrades is super important in that setting. I could see where that argument would be really strong.
I just had a question. So I would say I have a mix of low and high intensity active learning courses, but the high ones, I don't feel like they lend themselves to exams. I feel like any high intensity active learning course I have, I grade whatever they're doing for their active learning, their group work. And exams don't really come naturally if I'm not giving them a big chunk of information that they have to go home and absorb. So I'm just wondering if anybody else teaches a high intensity active learning course that they assess with exams.
Yes, or I have for about 12 years. And we would have take-home exams as at least part of the assessments. And there you're not asking students names of things, or you give them basically a short case study or something and have them analyze it. So it's a very different kind of way for students to show that they've gained something, where they can assess and put something else together. So sometimes it gets to the point of synthesis. Well, they do have to synthesize paragraphs and commentary.
And
It would be interesting to see how these exams differ, because if their courses are aligned, they should be assessing whatever the students are doing in class. So the exam in a high intensity course should be different from an exam with no active learning, I would assume. And then I would like to see a standardized exam just to see how much they actually learned compared to each other.
Not to like,
oh, go ahead,
I was just saying, not to be like braggadocious, but we have a standard exam that we had to give at the end of our intro sequence. And I would probably, I don't know that I quite reach high intensity active learning in my intro course. I feel like I get close. But I was by far well above most of my colleagues. And for the last 3 years, my students in all of my sections have been either the top out of 14 or 15 sections.
Nice.
And nobody, I just kept waiting for someone to be like, hey, maybe it's because
what is she doing?
Yeah. Like, because I didn't want to say it, right?
What could she possibly be doing?
Yeah, right. I'm wondering why this has turned into a trend. But I mean, that's anecdotal in a way, but
it's still informative. I mean, you're collecting data and there's results.
Yeah, because these were just standard multiple choice, and they weren't. I mean, I had to give them, and they weren't even that good of questions.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, here we go. So yeah, it was standard.
And I would say, to Holly's question too, I have a class I'm doing right now actually that's focused primarily on getting our more advanced students to learn how to critically evaluate primary literature. And so I will do quote unquote exams a couple times a semester. I'll give them a paper, and it's a take-home exam. I send them home over the weekend to work on it with a series of questions they have to answer, short answers that are designed to make them synthesize what they're seeing. And it's open book, and they can look up your term. There will be techniques in here you don't know very well. That's not what I'm testing you on, but can you tell me about what the data is saying? Can you criticize the data? That's what I'm looking for. And so I can get exam data off of that, but it's not going to be like a series of multiple choice questions. So this was my obsession in this paper, was the intensity and the relation to intensity. What are the other things that struck you guys as particular interesting aspects of this data and the results?
Michael, I just want to add on this figure 4 discussion.
Please. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, when I saw this paper from Freeman last year around summer, there's a study that came from in the area of physics education research, and I can send that link in chat.
Cool.
And that kind of like elaborates on some of the points that were raised by Catherine and somebody else about the main idea of that paper is that they were saying they demonstrated the similar thing, that the exam scores, there was definitely a difference in the performance of the students, and that was not it was students in general, and but they were saying that perception of the students in terms of what they're learning was much better in the passive learning environment compared to the active. And they kind of like there was one point in their discussion where they challenged the issue of randomization in the first Freeman paper that came in 2014. So maybe some of those factors might be accounted for, or maybe need to be identified in this difference in terms of the percentage passing, you know,
Yeah.
like you have that, there's not much, I don't know if compared to passive and low intensity, the gap in the percentage passing is lesser. But maybe what if the students are learning, their student perception is better in terms of learning.
And perception is fascinating, isn't it? That there's so much. You guys know the standard narrative at this point about incorporating active learning, where Catherine's already alluded to it, where they'll prefer lecture. They don't feel like they're actually learning. And then like a year, 2 years later, they're like, oh, wow, we actually learned this stuff better. Now, you don't get credit for it at that point because they've already nailed you on your course evals along the way. But like the evidence shows you that works. And so the idea when you bring up perception, I think is really useful for this discussion, because it wouldn't surprise me if the people in the high intensity environments might perceive they're not learning as much, but then the data would suggest otherwise.
Yeah, and they did that. They did their experiment that Dewitt was done was very interesting. So they did the instructor swapping of the same lesson plan, and they use the same lesson plan for passive learning and active learning, and they were swapping the instructors to make sure their study is, you know.
Oh, that's cool. So it's not like just a personality that's doing it.
Yeah, so I thought that kind of is was an interesting part of it. But yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty intriguing. And thank you for putting that. I saw you put the link into chat. Thank you for that.
You know what's fun? So if you're teaching an intro, and I'm presuming most intro courses have sort of a goal of data interpretation, right? So how do you read a figure? And if you want to start at the beginning before you've really gotten into a lot of content, you can give them papers from active learning classrooms that have, 95% confidence intervals and put that in there as the thing that they interpret.
Huh. Yeah.
That's
very meta. That's very meta. I like that.
I've totally done that. on the first day, you're like, interpret this figure. What does it say? Oh, active learning is really important. Gotcha.
That's actually a good idea. Can't argue with it. Now you're saying that, I think I'll adopt. I've got a couple things I'm picking up today. This has been very useful. Okay. Other discussion points people would like to bring up.
I was drawn to the sort of hearts and minds portion because that's what my some of my education research has been on, is sense of belonging in our intro bio group. And so I'm always sort of drawn into that and think about that a lot, because active learning is really sort of, it can exacerbate a group, an individual's sense of not belonging if a professor doesn't do a good job of managing group dynamics. So in general, right, the idea is that you have them working in small groups and they get to know each other, and it creates a sense of community and a sense of belonging. And that is absolutely true. But there also is the flip side where an individual can be excluded from their group, right? Which can make it worse than if they were just sitting by themselves listening to an instructor lecture. And so I always find that those things call out to me, because from it mentioned sort of a social justice, ethical reason for doing high intensity active learning. But for me, it also calls me that we also need to be trained on how to facilitate positive group dynamics so that we are actually getting that sense of community we want out of our active learning. And that's something that I had to spend some time learning because it wasn't part of my skill set.
And we've certainly discussed that in previous journal clubs, or the notion that we could spend an entire hour talking about how one puts groups together to be effective for all students involved. and then how one, as you say, gets the group dynamic to make sure everybody is learning. That's an entire, very complicated question. Yeah,
ground rules for fair treatment among the group members.
It's very good. And yeah, since this is their hypothesis, we should bring it up. Heads and Hearts hypothesis claims that the effect of evidence-based teaching and instructor soft skills is synergistic for underrepresented students. That's a really interesting way of putting it. So the combination of doing what the data tells us to do, but then your own communicative ability, your own empathy, compassion, understanding what's going on in your classroom gives the most. And I'm taking a very, I'm running with those soft skills in my own interpretation, but sort of the optimization of your class brings those two things together, the data and your own empathy, if you will. It's interesting, Catherine used the phrase social justice, which is something, we're certainly talking about more in 2020, but like thinking about it through that lens is not a bad thing, right? In terms of making sure you're reaching all your populations.
Yeah, so I want to sort of jump in and say that I've had groups where there's a student where English is their second language, and they've sort of been excluded in the group dynamics because of that. Just keeping up with the other students and their discussion has been difficult for some subset of students, and so working with that population as well makes you have to consider how they deal with the group dynamics, and if we're leaving them behind with this active learning, and how do we incorporate them into the group. But there's a part of me that thinks that in science classes in particular, so the language gets really difficult for a lot of students, but putting them in a group forces them to use the language. So I actually think it's better because I'm the only one that ever uses the language, right? So I'm talking about all these terms and they never have to use them. They never have to speak them. So I think forcing students to use all kinds of science jargon is good in a way. And it puts, it gives them that language and sort of empowers them to use that language, not just me.
I have a colleague, I was sitting in on her class once, and she did something really interesting, and she was having students work together to define some terms that are used. Now, mind you, there were things like evolution and natural selection, which a lot of misconceptions and a lot of loose language associated with those terms. But you just made me think of that it was really forcing, which I get, sometimes we have to force students, encouraging them at least to think about what the words mean and to start to become a little bit more facile with putting them into sentences and seeing the relationship between words that are related to each other, but definitely not identical to each other.
And that's an interesting point you guys are sort of making together there, that we talk about group learning and these kind of techniques as being inclusive and being good in that sense. But then if you sort of just do it for its own sake, you're not going to get the benefits if, as you, like the example you give, there's a language barrier or another cultural barrier, which would, to Holly's point before with group work, right, with the deferential treatment of an instructor, you're not going to get the effects that you're hoping for unless you take that extra step and know what's going on in your class. So that's an extra thing to have to think about.
Yeah, and one of I'll help students do a drawing on a whiteboard. And what I've decided to do, so I did it once, and I noticed that one person was doing the drawing, so one person feels comfortable with drawing, and they'll do the whole thing. And now I give every student a different colored marker, and they each have to put that marker. Everybody has got to contribute to that drawing. And so I am trying to pull everybody in and put them to work. Like nobody gets out of doing some of the work in the class. And that's And that seemed to work well. It's like, oh, okay, now I see all the colors of the rainbow on this drawing.
Exactly.
Everybody's contributed.
I like that.
So
The
there are,
concrete evidence everyone's contributed. That's cool.
Yeah, or I've done stuff with the whiteboard where, you know, I'll have groups of 4 typically is what I like. And yeah, the first person always grabs the marker, right, and starts up there, and that's the person most comfortable. And I'll let them write for about 1 minute, and then I'll be like, rotate. And then I let that second person go for about 2 minutes. And then and it's each person as they become less comfortable, they have more time at the board.
I have to be more deliberate about that this year. This particular class, I was just talking about, you know, counting up the percentage active learning I was doing. I've got 2 people in the class in particular that if I just let it go, will do all the work for the whole class. And so all those techniques we use to sort of distribute around the participation are coming to the fore in that particular experience for me. So I like these ideas, like putting in groups and making sure they're all contributing.
We sometimes have rotating assignments too, that for this week, everyone chooses puts their name on a slot at the beginning of the semester, and then their role for the week is defined, whether they're the one at the whiteboard or whether they're the one running the computer or they're the one who has to report to the class. Or
Yeah, that's cool.
I think having accountability for all the students is wonderful, and all the assignments should include that, but I think we still need to kind of spot check and know our students and their circumstances and I always try to promote empathy in the group, like, hey, this person's going to be coming late from the last class because I didn't tell them that, but because she gets extra time on her exams in the class before. But could you kind of like tread water for a couple minutes until she gets here to make sure that your group is all together? It just kind of, I don't know, kind of spot check, make sure that everybody's understanding what their group members need. And there's always, I feel like that overachieving student in the group really likes that opportunity to be like, oh, I'm the leader of the group and I'm making sure that my group is performing well by doing this empathetic thing
that's
for
for
the
sure.
group.
Yeah. So we are approaching the top of the hour. So I'd like to go ahead and sort of bring us, land the plane, if you will. Final thoughts about our paper.
I just want to, maybe I'm making a bold statement here, but I feel that the 2014 paper and this paper, the distinction is just the demographics, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe some technical differences in terms how the data was analyzed. And so I'm just curious about the data, where they collected the data. Was it only like in terms of the academic institutions? Was it only our institutions, 4-year PUIs? Did they look into any? And I didn't look into the supplemental, but was the data collected from one set of institutions?
So my read on that was no, that they went through, they were looking for undergraduate courses clustered in institutions. They have this whole section about coding where they talk about those sort of bias ideas that you're alluding to. So I don't think they were restrictive in institutional type. I think whenever possible, they tried to collect as much data as they could from parallel institutions to minimize bias on that. Those are definitely valid questions, but I think they tried to work around that as much as possible.
Yeah.
Having never done a meta-analysis, I'm sort of treading myself on like how they do that. But my interpretation of what's here in materials and methods makes me think that they've worked on that.
Yeah.
All right. This has been a really cool discussion this morning. Thank you guys very much. I am recording this, so you'll be able to, or I have been recording this, so you'll be able to watch this back if you would like. And we're going to have this paper discussion 2 more times, a week from tomorrow and then the Wednesday after that. So if you actually want to sort of have this discussion again, but with a different set of people, you are welcome to participate in that. And if you have other ideas for papers, pass them along to Sue and myself, and we will get them into the mix for the coming weeks. Okay.
Yeah.
Can I ask Holly to stay on the line? Do you have a minute? Can I ask you a question? Okay.
Certainly.
All right. In that